My family spent most of my life acting like I was a mistake they couldn't fix or send back. Then Dad died, and somehow, he made me the executor of his will. The very problem they thought was gone was suddenly in charge. What happened after that? Trust me, you don't want to miss it. My name is Josh. I'm 31, and for most of my life, I was the family's favorite punching bag. If something went wrong, it was my fault, even if I wasn't. My brother David could burn down a school and get a trophy. I once sighed too loudly and got called emotionally abusive. So let's dive into the story. I found out my father died through voicemail. Not from my mom. Not from my brother. Not even my sister. Nope. Raymond, the family lawyer, left a 10-second message that went something like, "Josh, sorry to inform you your father passed. Call me when you can. There's a matter of the will." That's it. No condolences. No family circle hug. Just pure business. Which, honestly, felt more sincere than anything my family had offered me in years. I stared at my phone for a long time. I hadn't spoken to any of them in nearly a decade, not since I pieced out at 18 and started building a life that didn't revolve around dodging emotional landmines. So yeah, I wasn't heartbroken. More, weirdly curious. Still, I called Raymond back, expecting maybe a logistical formality or some meaningless scrap of inheritance they couldn't figure out what to do with. Instead, he cleared his throat and said, "Josh, your father named you sole executor of the estate." I laughed. Like, actually laughed. Thought it was a sick joke. Then I realized Raymond didn't joke. Dry as the damn Sahara. He walked me through the documents and confirmed it. Legally binding, signed, dated, witnessed, sealed tighter than David's expense reports. To say I was suspicious is an understatement. This was the same man, my father, who once grounded me for disrespecting my mother's authority because I asked her not to scream at me in public. Same guy who nodded along while David told everyone I stole his laptop, when David had literally sold it for weed money. But apparently, somewhere between then and his last breath, Dad decided I was the guy to sort out the mess. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was regret. Or maybe he just didn't trust the others not to cannibalize each other for cash. Fair enough. Still, I didn't trust it. I asked Raymond if there were any weird clauses or last-minute amendments. Nope. Clean. Simple. Just a straight-up Josh is in charge now situation. For the next couple of hours, I sat with that executor of the will. The guy with the legal power to untangle my father's money, property, accounts, and make decisions. My decisions. Not David's. Not Karen's. Definitely not my mother's. It felt like being handed the remote to a TV that's been blaring nonsense for 30 years. A part of me wanted to toss the whole thing back and disappear again. Let them stew in whatever drama they had brewing. But then I thought about the years they spent kicking me around like a family hobby. The gaslighting. The favoritism. The endless little betrayals they pretended never happened. And I realized this wasn't a burden. This was a fucking opportunity. So I booked the flight. Took a few days off work. Set up a call with Raymond to go over the first steps. My voice didn't even shake. Hell, I was calm. Too calm. That kind of cold, focused calm that usually leads to people breaking things. Because I knew exactly what was coming. They were going to hate it. They were going to squirm, manipulate, whine, threaten, and cry. Maybe even pray. But it wasn't going to matter. They wrote me off at 18. Now I held the pen. Let the games begin. The funeral was a circus. Not in the loud, chaotic way. More like a choreographed performance where everyone pretended they weren't secretly stabbing each other with their eyes. A quiet, smug, passive-aggressive little pageant. I hadn't even gotten out of the car before Karen cornered me in the parking lot. "Josh," she said, like she was surprised I hadn't shown up in shackles. "You actually came." No hug. No, "How are you?" Just that flat tone she always used when she was trying to sound polite, but actually meant screw you. "Yeah," I said, slamming the door shut. Would have been rude to ghost Dad's farewell party, right? She flinched a little at the sarcasm, then pivoted right into guilt mode. "Mom's really fragile right now. I just hope you don't start anything." And there it was. Within 10 seconds, I was already the potential problem. Classic. Inside the church, David was front row, center stage. Black suit, perfectly combed hair, that stupid pensive face like he'd just finished solving climate change. People kept patting his shoulder like he was the damn widow. David had always been good at playing roles. The grieving son was just the latest one. Meanwhile, Linda sat beside him, dabbing her eyes with a tissue and whispering to anyone who'd listen about how hard this all was. He was such a rock, she sniffled. He kept us all together. Right. The man who let his son be emotionally crucified every Thanksgiving was apparently the family glue. I took a seat in the back. Not out of modesty, just survival instinct. Easier to observe from the shadows than be dragged into the show. After the service, they held a small reception in the church hall. Cheap coffee, dry cookies, and even drier conversation. I kept mostly to myself until Linda waddled over with that over-rehearsed, "You've grown" look on her face. "Joshua," she said, her hand on my arm. "I hope this can be a healing time for all of us." That's when I knew she'd heard. About the will. About me being the executor. I smiled. "Oh, definitely. I'm all about healing." She didn't know what to do with that, so she blinked and tried to regroup. "Your father wanted unity. He wouldn't have wanted disruption." Translation: "Don't fuck with our money, Josh." I didn't respond. Just nodded and sipped the worst coffee I'd had in a decade. Later, David finally approached me alone. He was too smart to confront me in front of the family. So instead, he pulled me aside near the coat rack and put on that calm, measured tone he used when trying to negotiate. "Look," he said, "I know things have been tense, but this doesn't have to be complicated." I blinked. Complicated? We all know Dad probably just didn't update the paperwork. "You've been gone for a long time, Josh." There it was. Subtle gaslight, spoon-fed with a shit-eating grin. "Actually," I said, "the documents are dated 9 months ago. So, unless he updated them while being legally dead, I think he knew exactly what he was doing." David's smile twitched. "This doesn't have to be adversarial." "Oh, I agree. It doesn't have to be. But that part's kinda up to you, isn't it?" He stared at me a second longer, jaw clenched just slightly, then gave me a condescending pat on the arm and walked off. Probably to go whisper with Karen about how to handle me. Raymond called the next morning to confirm a few formalities. The funeral was over. Time to get to work. First step, notifying the beneficiaries and preparing for the initial meeting. I told him to schedule it for next week. In person. At the house. "You sure you want that kind of heat?" he asked. "Oh, I don't just want it," I said. "I'm counting on it." Because here's the thing. They still thought this was going to play out like every other family event. I'd show up, they'd push back, I'd fold, and life would go on with them on top. They didn't realize the rules had changed. And I was done folding. The thing about being executor is, legally, I didn't need their permission for shit. But that didn't stop them from trying to act like I did. The first week after the funeral, I started digging into the financials. Raymond gave me access to all the estate documents, accounts, assets, property, everything. The house was paid off, the retirement accounts were healthy, and Dad had left a note in the files authorizing full discretion in asset distribution, which basically meant I was the judge, jury, and distributor. First red flag, a $75,000 loan from the estate to David's name. No repayment plan, no interest, not even a signature from Dad. Just a line item labeled family support. Right, that kind of support always seemed to skip me. Second red flag, Karen had submitted an alternate version of the will to Raymond 3 weeks before Dad died. This version named her and David as co-executors. Dated, signed, except the signature didn't match a damn thing on file, and the witness was some friend of hers who conveniently couldn't be reached. Raymond flagged it immediately as fraudulent and legally useless. Still, nice to know she tried to cheat her way in before the body was even cold. I didn't blow up. I didn't call or scream or send angry texts. I documented everything. Quietly. Then I sent out the formal notices. Meeting at the family house this Saturday. Required attendance for all named beneficiaries. Bring ID. Cue the dramatics. Karen replied with a wall of text about how emotionally unsafe it was to be around me. David sent a 2-sentence email. "Is this necessary? We can handle this civilly." And Linda? She didn't reply at all. She just showed up at my apartment the day before, uninvited, holding a tray of lemon bars like it was 2002. "You must be exhausted," she said as I opened the door. "Handling everything." I leaned on the frame. "You drove an hour to drop off lemon bars?" She smiled like she hadn't insulted my intelligence for 3 decades. "I just thought we could talk. One-on-one. Like family." Translation: I want to manipulate you without witnesses. I let her in, mostly for sport. She sat down and immediately launched into a speech about how stressful this was for everyone, how generous David had been over the years, how devoted Karen had been to Dad's care. You've been gone so long, she added. They were here for everything. I nodded. Yeah, about that. Care to explain why Karen forged a will? That shut her up fast. Her eyes went wide like I'd just slapped her with a shovel. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, too quickly. Raymond does, I replied. And now, so does the estate's fraud investigator. She stood up then, trying to hold on to her dignity. You don't need to make this ugly, Joshua. I tilted my head. Mom, it was always ugly. You guys just got good at pretending it wasn't. She left the lemon bars. I threw them in the trash. Saturday came. I got there early, made sure the locks still worked, and opened all the windows. The house smelled like old secrets and lemon-scented cleaner. Nothing had changed, down to the crooked picture frame in the hallway where David once shoved me by accident. They arrived late, naturally, all dressed like they were headed to court, which in a way, they were. Raymond handled the paperwork while I handed out packets. Copies of the real will, summary of assets, and a section titled Unresolved Financial Activity, with David's fake loan and Karen's forged document highlighted in color. David flipped through it like it was written in Mandarin. What is all this? It's the truth, I said. You should try reading it sometime. Karen was already sweating. Linda pretended to be confused. Raymond cleared his throat and explained that due to the attempted fraud and the discretionary authority granted to me, I could choose to withhold distributions pending review, which meant they weren't getting a cent. At least, not yet. David stood up, arms crossed. You're going to regret this. I smiled. I doubt it, because I hadn't even played my ace yet. That was still coming. I stood in my father's study, surrounded by leather-bound ledgers and framed diplomas collecting dust. This room was where he'd taught me to ride a bike by lifting the seat and running beside me. It was also where he'd yelled at me for being ungrateful when I asked why I couldn't attend college without his loan strings attached. Now, I held the power to decide who walked away with what, and I felt every memory pulse through me like electric currents. Raymond handed me the final distribution worksheet. It listed David, Karen, Linda, and me, until the very bottom, where a new line appeared. Evelyn Harbor, 35%. My fingertips tingled. Evelyn, the woman they'd erased from every family photo, was finally in print. I signed the page with deliberate strokes, sealing her inclusion and diluting all their shares. When I delivered the news, the room crackled. David's face went pale, veins pulsing at his temples. Karen's jaw dropped so hard I thought it might break. Linda looked like she'd swallowed a lemon, her hands twisting the edge of her blouse. They had expected the usual, an equal split or maybe a slightly fatter slice for themselves. They never saw this coming. I started with David. This, I said, tapping the worksheet, was Dad's idea long before he asked me to handle his affairs. He always regretted how he treated Evelyn. He felt guilty about how she helped me when no one else would. I kept my tone flat, letting the words land like bricks. She deserves a steak, just like the rest of us. David's mouth opened, then snapped shut. He tried to whine. That's not fair. She left us years ago. I folded my arms. She left because you and Karen made her life hell. Then you cheered when Dad cut her off. Now you get to see what empty-handed feels like. He leaned forward. You're betraying the family. I shrugged. I'm honoring my father's last real wish. Karen, voice trembling, whispered, You can't do this. Oh, I can, I replied. And I will. She sank onto the sofa, covering her face with her hands like a child caught with her hand in a cookie jar. Linda tried a final move, the martyr routine. Your grandmother, your father's mother, would be rolling in her grave. This isn't how this family. Please, I cut in. Spare me the legacy sermon. The only legacy I care about is truth. Her cheeks flushed. She turned away, shoulders hunched, as though she might shrink into the wallpaper out of shame. Then I brought up Evelyn's file. A stack of letters and photos. Evelyn teaching me to tie my shoes. Notes she'd tucked into my lunchbox. Postcards from coast-to-coast trips Dad took them on before the marriage collapsed. I laid them out on Dad's oak desk like evidence in a trial. This is the real history, I said. Not your version. David tried again to browbeat me. All this drama for a woman who abandoned us. I met his gaze. She never abandoned me. She left to escape your manipulation. Don't tell me she didn't try to save you from yourself. He closed his eyes and walked out, muttering about lawyers and lawsuits. Karen followed without a word. Linda stayed a moment longer, silent, her lips pressed so thin they nearly disappeared. When they'd gone, I closed the file and leaned back against the desk. Raymond cleared his throat and offered to finalize the amended documents. I told him to prepare 2 copies, one for the court, one for Evelyn. He nodded, eyebrows raised as if to say, good choice. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the blinds, I filed the paperwork. Evelyn's share was now incontrovertible. I imagined her face when she received the news, a mix of vindication and relief. For the first time, she'd be acknowledged not as an afterthought, but as a central part of our family's story. I didn't gloat. I'd learned my lesson about petty triumphs. Instead, I sat quietly in that study, letting the weight of what I'd done settle in. The house felt different already, like a vault unlocked, secrets spilling into the open air. I could almost smell freedom. My phone buzzed. A text from Linda. You've ruined everything. I typed back, no, I fixed it. Hit send. Then stood and walked out of that room, knowing the next move was theirs. Lawsuits, pleas, tantrums, or maybe an apology. But none of that would change the fact that Evelyn belonged here now, in name and in share. And I made sure it stayed that way. Let the fallout begin. I sent the invitations with a simple note. Will reading and discussion at 2 p.m. sharp, family home. No hints, no theatrics, just a time and place. By midday Saturday, I arrived early, unlocked the door, and walked through the foyer where Dad once stood grinning as he watched me chase the dog. The air smelled of aged oak and dust, a mix that felt like breathing history. I set out 5 printed programs on the entry table, the Betrayal will, an asset summary, and a timeline of key family events tied to each room. Then I waited. They trickled in. First Linda, then Karen, clutching her purse like a life raft, and finally David, suit pressed and eyes narrowed. None of them said hello. None met my gaze. I handed each a program and motioned toward the living room. Welcome home, I said, voice calm. It felt more like reading instructions than greeting guests. They shuffled in and took seats on the couch and folding chairs. Raymond hovered by the doorway, briefcase in hand, wearing that dry, this should be interesting expression. Before we begin, I started, we'll take a tour. Each room holds a memory. No questions. No complaints. They knew better. I led them into the living room, where the wallpaper still had the stain from the night David slammed the door so hard Mom thought the house might collapse. This is where I first realized Dad favored David, I said, pointing. He bought David his first bike, while I waited 2 years for my allowance to cover mine. David tensed. Linda looked away. Karen bit her lip. Next, the dining room, an awkward rectangle of polished wood and stiff chairs. I paused beneath the chandelier. Here, I was blamed for spilling wine on Grandma's dress, though it was David's elbow. I got grounded for a week while he got a pat on the back for learning to control himself. I waved at the scuff marks on the floor where I'd practiced my apology speech. Karen's eyes filled with tears as she realized I remembered every damn detail. We moved into the hall outside the bedrooms, narrow and cluttered with framed diplomas David insisted on hanging. This hallway witnessed my biggest humiliation when I confronted David about his lies at 18, and he pushed me so hard I slammed into that wall. I said, tapping a dent. Dad lectured me on respect, then handed David a plaque for outstanding leadership. Linda's lips quivered. Karen looked away. David's jaw clenched like he was waiting to explode. Then the master bedroom, Dad's sanctuary. I led them in and stood near the dresser mirror where I'd watched Dad rehearse what he would say at my college graduation, then change his mind and cancel my scholarship. This room was Dad's safe space, I said, until he realized how much damage he caused by empty promises. That's why he made me executor. He wanted someone who understood consequences. I squeezed the edge of the dresser, feeling the grain under my fingertips, and held their stares until Karen swallowed hard. Next, my old bedroom, the epicenter of my exile. The walls still bore the poster I hung at 16, a defiant quote about carving your own path. I ran my hand along the desk where I wrote letters Dad ignored, then tossed. This was my refuge, I said. It's where I decided to leave and never look back. I gestured at the dusty shelf. Everything I owned, my books, my clothes, my dreams, went in boxes while they watched me leave. Not one of you offered help. Silence. Even Raymond seemed moved. Finally, we circled back to the entry hall. I pressed a button on my phone, and a projector lit up the wall with photos. Dad laughing with Evelyn at the beach, Evelyn coaching me through my first job interview, and a Christmas morning where she knitted me a scarf while the rest of the family ignored us. I stepped forward. These are the real memories. They're part of this estate too. They're part of my inheritance. I let that hang. I opened the programs. Now, we discussed the distributions, I said. You each have a share listed here. I pointed to their names and percentages. Their faces flickered with hope until they saw Evelyn's name at 35%, reducing their stakes. Linda gasped. Karen covered her mouth. David's eyes went murderous. I walked you through these rooms so you'd feel what I felt every day, I said softly. Every bruise, every accusation, every favor you accepted and denied me. It all counts. I closed the folder with a decisive snap. This house is my father's legacy of memories. I've honored it by naming its true heirs. Any objections can be directed to Raymond. I nodded to our lawyer. He cleared his throat and asked if there were questions. No one spoke. They filed out without a word, programs clenched like proof they still belonged. I locked the door behind them and stood alone in the empty house. Light filtered through dusty windows, illuminating the floating particles like ghosts of the past. I felt lighter than I had in years. The walls no longer felt oppressive. They felt free. I texted Evelyn the scanned copy of her share. Her reply came almost instantly. Thank you. You've done more than I ever dreamed. I stared at the message, a small smile tugging at my lips. Then I left the house, closing the chapter on their hypocrisy and opening one on a future where my story finally had a voice.